Welcome, everyone. The Florida School Counselor Association is proud to present this webinar on compassion fatigue in school counselors, caring for the caregivers. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for replay at a later date. We have with us today Dr. Rosine Dougherty, who's an associate professor for Argosy University in Sarasota, Florida. She's currently the Director of Training for College of Education. As Director of Training, Dr. Dougherty is responsible for overseeing all internships in school counseling, school psychology, and education administration. She's been a teacher, school counselor, and school principal for the past 40 years, and has been a regional, state, and national conference presenter in the subject areas of accountability and data collection, ADD, ADHD, bullying and harassment in schools, compassion fatigue, and counselor burnout, critical incident stress management, disaster response, mentoring, play therapy, and self-injurious behavior. I'll be monitoring the questions area today, so if you have a question or a comment, please use that area to type that in, and we'll stop periodically to answer your questions. And we'll also reserve the last 5 minutes of the webinar at about 11:25 in order to address final questions and answers. So we are ready to get started. Dr. Rosine Dougherty.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Sabella, for inviting me back to chat with everyone about this very important subject of compassion fatigue. So I welcome all of you. I know how busy you all are and taking time out of your busy day to have this discussion with me about this subject. So we'll go ahead and get started. As Dr. Sabella said, I am a counseling educator, and I do primarily teach in the school counseling program here at Argosy in Sarasota. And this is a subject that I have added to my teaching for my school counseling students, because I didn't get this kind of training when I was a counseling student, and found that I really needed it in my experience when I was a practicing school counselor. So I shared this with you today. I look forward to your comments and our discussion here at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. So I start off kind of Debbie Downer, but I wanted to jump right in and talk about some of the realities of being a professional school counselor. And this, of course, is the type of violence that we have and we are experiencing in our schools. You personally may have had some experience with this, or we certainly are quite aware of what's happening nationally across our schools and universities that have to do with students reporting and being threatened and injured in the schoolhouse. The School Survey on Crime and Safety is an important survey that is conducted, and this is the most recent one that I could find, 2009-2010, with some really startling statistics about what is happening in our public schools, what kind of percentage of students are reporting coming to school with weapons. I'm not going to read it. I will certainly let you read that. But there's a clear indication that this is happening across our schools. And like I said in my intro that you have all read, it's not if it happens, it's probably when it happens. Not necessarily gun violence, but some sort of crisis or disaster will happen in our schools, and are we prepared, and then are we prepared ourselves in keeping ourselves healthy and being able to cope? So these, of course, are the most famous, or should I say infamous, violence in our schools in recent history. And of course, no one can forget right before Christmas at Sandy Hook, and we're still reeling from that violent situation. But I want to make a point that that's not all. It's, you know, that's what always hits the radio and the TV, and that seems to what gets the coverage. But really, as school counselors, we all know, if you've been practicing for any length of time, that we deal with many, many, many other kinds of crises and disasters in our schools every day that never get on TV, never get on the radio, but that we as school counselors are on the front lines and deal with, and many times there has to be a very long intervention to help our students and our families and our faculty and staff. Two new areas that I have added this year compared to when I did this presentation 2 years ago, because this has really come to the forefront, and that is how this mass joblessness has caused so much homelessness, not even in just the state of Florida, but across the country, and how we as school counselors are having to deal with these long-term crises in our schools for our children, and then how do we deal with this? This isn't just a one day or a one-time occurrence. This is something for some families, for some students, for some school counselors that continue day after day and year after year. And then of course what we're seeing, a lot of new research, which is quite amazing, not surprising, but the research is beginning to support that as our soldiers are returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan with PTSD, that now spouses of those soldiers, be it male or female, and their children are also developing PTSD based on compassion fatigue that these spouses and children are feeling toward their spouse or their parent as they return. And so many of our school counselors across the country are having to deal with children who are now developing this PTSD based on compassion fatigue. So two new ones that, again, it's not something that's going to be fixed or we're going to be able to deal with quickly. It's going to be a long-term intervention. Now, my personal experience is back already in 2000, we had a prescribed burn in our hometown of Los Alamos, New Mexico, that turned into a out-of-control fire and ended up burning down half the homes in our small community. We only had 18,000 people. And I worked as a school counselor at that time in Mountain Elementary School, which of course was snuggled right up against the mountains. So we had a huge percentage, over 60% of our students in my school at that time lose their home in a fire. And this particular picture, which is quite dramatic, actually was the home burning of our special education teacher. And where she saw this first happening was on TV. We were all evacuated. About 4 or 5 days prior to this, to May 6th, and of course we were all glued to our TV sets, and Dawn, who was our special education teacher, actually saw this image on TV of her very own home burning. So when we came back from being evacuated and saw our sweet little town half burned down, and that over 60% of my school was affected, this became not only a community-wide crisis and disaster, but became something on my shoulders as a school counselor in this building. How do I now deal with this long-term intervention of this disaster? And so I'll talk a little more about that as we go along. So, we know what our roles are. We know that we have so much on our plates. We know our appropriate duties and our inappropriate duties, and that's for a whole nother webinar to talk about that. But we know that we have lots to do in a day. But when we now have to combine all of our regular daily duties along with our long-term crisis response, this may then cause us, for us ourselves, to go into burnout and compassion fatigue. So, but let's let's define a couple, because burnout is not the same as compassion fatigue. So I kind of wanted to take care of that right off the bat, because burnout, you hear people about having burnout in every profession. Okay, it's widespread. You can find it in every profession, in that they're under, difficult working conditions, are not valued as employees, and so we go into this feeling of burnout, dysfunction, diminished mental and physical health, as the slide says. And so anyone in any profession could end up finding themselves in a burnout situation. Burnout in school counselors is well documented in the research. We go into burnout just like anybody else, and many times it's based on our loads, our ratios, just like any other profession. Some of you might have even felt that way. Maybe some of you are even feeling that way now as we're heading into the last few months of school, and it's just been an exhausting school year. We're overextended and we're drained. Lambie had a great study. It's getting a little old now, but I really like this study because it goes into great detail about burnout and professional school counselors. And of course, it's what you would think would happen. Yes, do school counselors have burnout? We absolutely do. But that there is a negative correlation between burnout and ego functioning. In other words, as burnout goes up, our ego functioning and our ability to function goes down. It makes sense. Research supports that. However, the higher the level of our support for this exhaustion, for this depersonalization, actually the burnout begins to drop. Also, they have found that the years that we have been a practicing school counselor also impacts our level of burnout and how well we cope. But burnout is not necessarily traumatic. So here's the definition of what a traumatic event looks like. You can go ahead and read that. It makes sense. We have all been trained in being able to recognize trauma. All right. But burnout doesn't necessarily have to be a traumatic event. As I stated before, it could be just we're overworked, we're exhausted, we're not valued, too much on our plate, too high ratio, difficult student population. So these different traumatic events. So now let's kind of start moving into then how is compassion fatigue different than burnout? Well, here some definitions. You may see these terms: secondary traumatic stress, secondary traumatization, or vicarious traumatization. They're used interchangeably in the field and in research. But basically, it's kind of what I put there on the slide, and that is that it's secondary traumatic stress that we are now beginning to feel in our own psyches and our emotional states and our physical well-being. Some of the same feelings that our primary trauma students, families, spouses are feeling based on the relationship and the association with someone who has been the primary trauma victim or person. They don't necessarily have to be a victim, but they could have certainly had some trauma in their life. So you will see these three terms. Of course, I think you're all familiar certainly with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's in the news a lot right now, especially, like I said, with our soldiers that are coming back. And so you can just take a quick look at that. I just wanted to make sure to include some of those symptoms of PTSD. One type of symptom that many times folks don't understand or don't recognize until they really start paying attention to and become cognitive of is that hypervigilance, that someone is jumpy. that they're really jumpy and sounds scare them easily, and a noise or someone coming up behind them, not meaning to scare them, but they're very, very jumpy. That's hypervigilance. And many times you see that in folks, in our students and our family members that may be demonstrating behaviors of PTSD. So then, what is compassion fatigue? It is exactly what I just described as that vicarious traumatization, that secondary traumatization based on our relationships, be it professional or personal, with someone who is the primary victim or the person who has the primary trauma. It is a comprehensive term. Okay, so how are they different? Pretty obvious, but I thought I'd throw in a couple of slides to make sure that we're clear. And that compassion fatigue, while some of the symptoms in our physical beings and in our emotional states may appear somewhat similar, how we get burnout and compassion fatigue can be very different. Most folks who get compassion fatigue are those of us in a profession that we are in the helping profession. It could be teachers, counselors, doctors, policemen, firemen, any profession that is seen as a helping profession. Even attorneys can experience and have shown in research can be susceptible to compassion fatigue. Where burnout is not a natural consequence within a profession. Okay? Usually it's based on some outside variables that cause that burnout. For compassion fatigue, it could be a natural consequence of being a helping professional. And the other important point is that last bullet, and that is you may still have a really positive attitude about your job and about what you do as a professional school counselor and still have compassion fatigue. That's one of the biggest differences between compassion fatigue and burnout. Usually in burnout, you're feeling disassociated, depersonalized, you get really apathetic. Not so with compassion fatigue. With compassion fatigue, you may still be loving your job, doing a great job, really being in there, feeling like you're doing a great job, and in the meantime, you're draining, and then become ineffective. So here's another picture. This is actually a fireman and a neighbor. This was a fireman who was trying very desperately, as you can see, with a simple little hose, because the fire truck was 2 doors down, trying to save his home. And he could not bear to be there to try to save his own home, so he went 2 homes down, found a garden hose, and was trying to save, but as you can see, it was absolutely, it was gone by the time he by the time he got there to try to save this home. So they are not only being in the service provider as a fireman, he himself was losing his home 2 doors down. Again, good friend of mine, Judy, she was a Red Cross volunteer, but she was also a victim. So you can see how while she was then giving aid and help and comfort to others, she was also dealing with the devastation of losing her own home, and you can pretty much understand where her compassion fatigue came from. So, while the event may be instantaneous, God forbid it could be a moment that someone is shot, there could be long-term repercussions and long-term intervention that we as school counselors then need to have to deal with that initial tragedy and then the consequences of that tragedy or that disaster. And then we have to be in a mental place where we can then endure that long-term intervention and stay healthy ourselves. Okay, so what do we say? Not a problem. I can deal with it. I'm trained. I know about this. I've had my, my trauma training. I'm on the crisis team. I've helped write the crisis plan for my school. I can deal with this. I can tell you from experience that denial is one of the most detrimental symptoms of compassion fatigue. Many times we do not even recognize that it's happening until we become dysfunctional. So that is why I feel very strongly about this subject, and I really appreciate being able to present this to you, because many times we just say, oh, I'm just tired. Oh, I'm just exhausted. I'll feel better tomorrow. Not necessarily. We need to have the courage to really look at ourselves and how we're functioning and whether or not we're staying effective school counselors, or are we becoming impaired because of the level of intervention that we're having to give our families and our children based on a long-term intervention for a disaster or for a traumatic event in our schools. All right, 86.9% of emergency response personnel say that they have had some feeling distressing from that distressing event. That's a pretty big percentage. So I just throw that in there because we're not emergency response personnel, but are we? I would say we are. We may not necessarily be police or fire department, but we certainly are emergency response personnel in our school buildings. So how do we know if we're taught to understand and recognize the symptoms? Hopefully we will then prepare ourselves, be more proactive rather than reactive, not only for our faculty and our students and our staff and our parents, but for ourselves. We need to be able to recognize the symptoms in ourselves so we can be more preventative. In my case, didn't recognize it, stayed in denial until I ended up having to go into therapy myself because I became so dysfunctional in my position and didn't quite understand what was going on. I just figured, I was having trouble in my marriage, nothing was going right at work, I couldn't cope with anything, I was angry, I was exhausted, I stopped exercising. I just thought I was in a pretty bad funk for quite a while, didn't know that I had a definition of what was happening to me. So if we can understand the symptoms and, more importantly, recognize them, hopefully we will prevent it, or at least recognize to get help. We may not be able to prevent it. We're human beings, and we're in a giving service profession. Being able to recognize it and get the help is what I'm really advocating for all of you today. All right, so seek assistance. So, of course, then what are the dangers of having it? Well, we know in our ethical code that it's really important, and we talk about the importance of self-care as professional school counselors, but many times we get wrapped up, and I'm actually going to talk about this at the end, where we get wrapped up in the feeling of compassion satisfaction. And actually there's nothing wrong with that. Compassion satisfaction is what keeps us coming back every day, back to our jobs. We get a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction that we're actually doing good things with kids, and good things with our families. There's nothing wrong with that. But what happens in a long-term intervention when it comes to something traumatic is that while we may be honored, for our dedication, what may end up happening is that we become impaired. And we might, just may, be making harmful or incorrect decisions for our students, for our parents, and could then end up not being an effective or even a not competent or unethical school counselor based on that we have, based on the fact that we have compassion fatigue, but we're in denial or we don't recognize it. Okay, so what are some of the symptoms? Pretty much the same as PTSD, very interestingly. So, misplaced anger, you can read them. Insomnia. Ones for me is that I definitely had increased irritability. It was hard for me to sleep, and boy, did I throw myself into my work. That one right there in the middle was me from morning till dark. My kids needed me. That was my job to make this right for them, and I was there early, I stayed late, I was calling parents, I was setting up outside therapy and counseling for them. I threw myself into my job because I felt like I needed to help every single one of those 300 kids who lost their homes, and some of our staff members who had lost their homes. Many times substance abuse, it could be food, alcohol, or drugs. For lots of us, it's food. Oh, just give me the pizza. So you start eating junk food out of anxiousness and irritability. Hypertension, of course. And a big one for me was hypervigilance, being very jumpy. I'm still, 13 years later, a little jumpy. I was very jumpy at that time. Things would startle me. The simplest sounds, people walking by would startle me. I had hypervigilance. So, but are we still in denial? And so you may say, okay, great, I see the list, I understand the list, but am I really? Well, in the last couple of years, I have discovered a couple of more great tests that you can use for compassion fatigue and life stress, not only for your faculty and your staff, but for yourself, that you can actually do an assessment of yourself whenever you find yourself in these situations, and all of a sudden you're going, wow, I'm just not feeling right, or maybe someone has come to you and say, you're not your regular self, and again, denial, don't recognize it. So I've included these. I'm not sure if you get access to the PowerPoint. I hope you do. I'm certainly happy to share it with you. And you can actually go to these websites. They're free for you to take. And as long as you don't make any money off of it, you can actually use this with your faculty to also help them to determine whether or not they're feeling compassion fatigue or life stress. So I really hope you use these. Yes.
Dr. Dougherty, yeah, I was going to say we can provide the PowerPoint.
Sure.
If you send it to me, we'll put it up there with a link, and everybody will get that link.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely. I definitely want them to have it. Super. Thank you, sir. All right, and then these were the additional assessments that I had from a couple of years ago. So there's lots of ways, there's lots of different scales and questionnaires and self-tests. So if you're that kind of person who really likes, that hard data, who really wants to be able to look at a scale to see kind of where you fall or where a faculty member falls, you can use this for yourself. You can use this in consultation with other adults, right? So those will be available in the PowerPoint as well. So how do we begin to cope? As we said, we're trained, we understand when we have our ethics classes and in our ethical standards, our ASCA ethical standards, it talks about the importance of self-care. Right? Nothing on this list should surprise you, really. There's a couple of things that may surprise you as far as working in a traumatic situation. But first and foremost is recognizing the symptoms so we can learn how to cope. And second, very important, ask for, and this is hard for some of us, to accept help from others and from other professionals, such as mental health counselors. That was one of the hardest things for me. Say, I've got this, I'm the counselor, I'm doing all this counseling, I'm going out to, I was at an elementary school, going out to every recess, doing every lunch duty, talking to kids. I couldn't do it all. I had 300 children who were traumatized, who lost their homes, who were homeless, who the only place they had was their school. They were so great when they came back. We got back, we only had about 10 days of school left that school year, and then it was summer vacation, and I went, whew, good thing, wow, all right. We got summer vacation to recover. Guess what? When we got back in August, it was worse. Why was it worse? Because the actual, the trauma of the actual event had subsided, but now the reality of the loss had set in. And so for that whole next school year, 2001, 2002, I was dealing with this sense of loss with these 300 students. And so I thought, school counselor, I'm good at this, I'm competent, I can do this. I couldn't. I couldn't do that level of intervention with 300 kiddos. When I finally recognized that I needed help, I finally asked for help, and guess what? The district gave me all the help I needed. They brought in some mental health counselors to help me. Excuse me just for a minute. Well, at the very beginning, when it first happened, and like many crisis plans, we had counselors come from the other schools. That was very helpful. But by the next school year, they were off to their own schools. Mountain School was, kind of left, to tend for ourselves. And so it was that next school year when I finally realized, excuse me, I needed more help. So please ask and accept help from other professionals if you have a community-wide and or a massive school-wide traumatic event or disaster that happens in your school. You cannot handle it alone. You shouldn't handle it alone. So make sure you accept help from other professionals who come into the building either on a weekly or daily basis to help you counsel. Talk with kids, help debrief adults. So when we look at the self-care strategy list, pretty obvious. But I want you to really take a notice of the fourth bullet. And that is, it sounds counterintuitive, but increase emotional distancing and protect from being overwhelmed, block emotions during the event, and utilize relaxation techniques, and do not look at their faces. That was one of the things that really surprised me once I got into therapy myself, and I really started learning more about long-term trauma and how to deal with that myself as a counselor. That many times we do need to be able to have a little bit of emotional distancing at the time so we can continue to function and continue to being effective. And so it feels like, oh no, we should be right there, we should be looking them straight in the eye, but do you understand why? We need to stay healthy and balanced ourselves to really be effective for them. It's like when you go into an airplane and you're taking off, and what do they always say about the oxygen mask? They say, put your mask on first before you help the person or the child beside you. It's basically the same thing. We need to have that oxygen mask on ourselves before we can be effective and really be helpful to our students and our faculty and our staff and our parents. So we need to be able to have a little bit of an emotional distancing so we can maintain our health and our balance to continue long term. The rest, I think, are pretty self-evident. I hope you've had a chance to read them while I was talking. Okay, so helping others cope. And of course, our teachers, and our administrators, we always think, well, we're the ones, we're the counselors, and so we're mostly dealing with this. We always deal with these highly emotionally charged issues in our buildings. But you know what? When you have a large trauma or disaster that affects the entire building, teachers, administrators, staff members are also going to be feeling this compassion fatigue. And so if we can then turn around and train our faculty to recognize these symptoms, we're going to have a healthier staff, healthier faculty, and consequently healthier children, because our teachers are going to be more present and they're going to be more effective to help our students who are also traumatized. We also, as school counselors, need to recognize if a teacher is maybe not becoming as effective, or they have not stayed as effective based on that you recognize symptoms in them, to be able to go to them and help them and consult with them as far as what you're seeing and teaching them about compassion fatigue. We are on the front lines. So this is all about being proactive today, recognizing it and being ready for it, knowing that we haven't done anything wrong to cause compassion fatigue, but that it's real and we need to be ready for it when it does happen. So strategies for helping our faculty and staff. There's that routine visits. I highlighted it in red. Routine visits by other mental health professionals. Please be willing to accept help in your building from other school counselors and or other mental health professionals that can come in and help you counsel and be present for your students and staff. We need to seek out families who need assistance. Okay? Watch for that misplaced anger in your faculty. Giving recognition and support, of course, is obvious. One thing that we should be doing as school counselors when we have a long-term intervention or a school-wide long-term disaster or traumatic event, and that is to debrief our faculties on a regular basis. We should be touching base with them and actually setting up time, not just saying to them, oh, well, if you need me, come see me in my office. No, you need to work out with administrators in the building actual times that are set aside for you to be able to debrief with your faculty and staff to see how they're doing, to reinforce that these feelings that they're having, as my slide says, a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Okay, being able to normalize those feelings of despair and fear and whatever they may be. So these debriefings need to be done on a regular basis, not just, well, come see me if you need me, because most won't. So it's important that we do offer that kind of service to our faculty and staff. And reassure your staff, and I want to reassure you that there's no perfect way to handle a traumatic event. I can tell you from experience during our fire, we had a super crisis plan. The county had a great crisis plan. I was on the crisis team, but I can tell you all, when a disaster happens of that magnitude, those crisis plans go right out the window, because it is so pervasive and it affects so many people in the community, or in our case, 60% of our school were homeless. That crisis plan barely began to even to address the issues that we had to deal with over the next 2 or 3 years. Matter of fact, we had some students 5 years later who were still displaced. Their homes still were not rebuilt, and they were still fighting with FEMA about rebuilding their homes. Long-term intervention for those families. All right. So this was the one piece that I wanted to make sure to include, because, while we're talking about compassion fatigue and what it does to us, I think you all understand and maybe even have felt this, and that when you're in a helping profession, there is a silver lining to all of this compassion, and that's called compassion satisfaction. I'm sure all of you who are on this webinar have experienced these very positive feelings when you're practicing as a school counselor. Watching now in this case, this study was not on school counselors, but on mental health counselors, so they call them clients. So I was true to the study and left it clients, but we can certainly put in there students for ourselves, because I fully believe that they do apply to us as well, because I know as a school counselor I enjoyed watching my students change and grow based on my interventions and the things that I did for them and their families. We like being part of that healing process. We enjoy witnessing the resilience of our students, and that I always was so amazed about how much I learned about me and how much I changed based on my students, and that their own personal growth changed me as well as me changing them. So this is all about compassion satisfaction. And so what we want to do is to be able to get back to compassion satisfaction rather than just compassion fatigue. So a couple of organizations and again some additional resources for you. Perry. Okay. And this is a new one that didn't exist a couple of years ago, and that's the Compassion Fatigue Awareness Project. That's the website. It's a great organization that's dedicated to us to help us sustain our self-care and what we need to be able to recognize compassion fatigue and then how to help those whom we work with. All right. And the founder of this project is Patricia Smith. She has 2 great books, Compassion Satisfaction, 50 Steps to Healthy Caregiving, and To Weep for a Stranger, Compassion Fatigue in Caregiving, and they are both available on Kindle if you like to use Kindle. But this is a great website, lots of great information here, a great springboard to other ideas and to other websites on this website as well.
All right, Dr. Dougherty,
So,
I just want to remind folks that we will be saving the last few minutes for questions and answers, and if they want to use the question area to type in their questions, we'll start fielding those in just a little bit.
Excellent. I have 2 more slides and we're all done, so that's perfect timing. So I just sort of wanted to end my webinar with you today because when I went into therapy, this was one of the most important things that the therapist said to me. And I went in, I explained the situation, how I was feeling ineffective, explained to him what was happening in my life, explaining to him what was happening in my school building, and he looked right at me and he said, Rosine, you're not going to fix this one. And I remember him saying that like he said it yesterday, and that was, 13 years ago. Not really, well, more like 12, 11 years ago when I finally went into therapy for this. And when he said those words to me, I just bawled and cried, and because see, I knew cognitively, I knew that, but see, spiritually in my heart, it was like, no, I have to be there for those kids. It's my job, and I wasn't giving myself permission to grieve or to take care of myself. And so that was so important for me to hear that. So I share that experience with you, that I sort of end with the slide that, taking care of yourself is probably one of the most important things you can do as a professional school counselor to stay effective, to stay competent, to stay ethical. Put that oxygen mask on yourself first. So 3 main components: self-kindness. Take care of yourself. Understand that you are vulnerable. You're a human being and you care about others and you care about kids. You wouldn't be in this profession. And that it may be a natural outcome, this compassion fatigue, based on what's happening in our lives and in our buildings. And that we have a common humanity, that we're not perfect, not even us as school counselors. We can make mistakes, and we get help to seek help. And then, of course, mindfulness. And this is the part that really, for me, that I had to get out of denial and recognize that I could be vulnerable, and that asking for help was not a sign of weakness. On the contrary, asking for help when you're impaired actually is a sign of competence as a professional school counselor. Sometimes, someplace in all of our lives, we're going to be impaired based on, life events, either those, in our personal life or in our professional life. So not ignoring your own painful feelings is so important. And I just end with this graphic. Woo! Life begins on the other side of despair. This was a playground just a block and a half down from Mountain School, and this was the craziness of that fire. You can see that the play equipment was burned and melted, and right across the street, the house across the street wasn't touched. And that was our reality. We had some students who lost everything, and then other students who were basically still coming to me for counseling because of survival guilt. So it wasn't that I was just counseling students who lost their homes. I was counseling the students who lived in that house across the street, whose house was the only one still standing, and why didn't my house burn down too? So, but life does begin on the other side of despair, and go and do good work. Help yourself. Know that compassion fatigue is a reality in our lives, but when you recognize it and get help and be kind to yourself, you will stay effective and competent. So that's all I have, other than all my references. And that's it. Thank you, everyone. Any questions, Dr. Sabella? I don't know. Is anybody else there? Can you all still hear me? Just waiting for questions. Okay. I will definitely send Dr. Sabella the PowerPoint, and hopefully he will put that on along with the webinar. And so please feel free to use any of the resources that I have included for you. And if any of you have any questions at all for me, you can contact me at rmdougherty. So it's RMDOU. Matter of fact, let me type it in. Let me just type it in for you, my email address, RMD. Okay, so my email address is rmdougherty@argosy.edu. And if you have any questions or would like any additional information or resources, I have lots. So please don't hesitate. I'm always happy to chat with any of my school counseling colleagues. Love to hear your stories, and anything I can do to help you, it's my pleasure. So thanks, everyone.